Somewhere around 1200 BC, the lights went out, not slowly, not in the way that empires usually decline, one province at a time, one generation of rot, one slow loosening of the centre. This was different. Within the space of roughly 50 years, almost every major civilization in the Eastern Mediterranean either collapsed entirely or contracted so severely that what survived barely resembled what had existed before. The Mycenaean palace world disappeared. The Hittite Empire, which had once fought Egypt to a standstill, ceased to exist as an imperial power. Ugarit, one of the wealthiest trading cities in the Eastern Mediterranean, burned and was never rebuilt. Egypt survived, but the new kingdom that emerged from the crisis would never fully recover its old reach. We do not know exactly what happened. That is not a failure of archaeology. It is the honest answer, and the question that sits underneath all of it, the one that 3,000 years of distance and more than a century of serious scholarship have not fully answered, is not simply what happened. It is why a world this connected, this sophisticated, this deeply organized, could not save itself. Find a position that lets your body go heavy. Let the room settle around you. This story begins not with the collapse, but with the world that existed before it. You cannot understand what was lost without first understanding what was there to lose. And what was there to lose was more remarkable than most people ever learn. In the summer of 1980, a Turkish sponge diver named Mehmet Kakir was working the waters off the southern coast of Turkey, near a rocky cape called Uluburun. He had been diving these waters for years. He knew the seabed the way a farmer knows a field, by what was supposed to be there and what was not. What he found that day was not supposed to be there, a pile of metal ingots on the seafloor, under roughly 30 meters of dark water, flat rectangles with 4 handles, stacked where no one had stacked them intentionally for thousands of years. He reported what he had seen, and what followed was one of the longest underwater excavations in the history of archaeology. A project that would take 11 seasons and reshape how historians understand the ancient Mediterranean. The ship that carried those ingots sank sometime in the 14th or early 13th century BC, a merchant vessel, mid-sized by the standards of the late Bronze Age, probably crewed by a few dozen men. The cargo it was carrying when it went down has taken researchers decades to fully catalogue. Cemal Pulak, the archaeologist who led much of the excavation work, described it in published research as among the richest late Bronze Age assemblages ever recovered. A cross-section of what moved between the great powers of that world and what that cargo reveals about the world it came from is something that still quietly shifts the way the ancient world is understood. There were 350 copper ingots on board. Each one weighed around 5 kilograms, 10 tons of copper in total, which by the estimates of scholars who study Bronze Age metal production represented a significant portion of what a major palace economy might process in a year. There was also tin, in ingots of similar shape, roughly in the ratio that bronze production required. 1 part tin to around 10 parts copper. Bring them together under sufficient heat and you get the metal that gave this entire age its name. But the copper and tin were only the beginning. The cargo included large ceramic storage vessels used across the Eastern Mediterranean, many still containing residue that later analysis identified as terebinth resin, a fragrant substance used in rituals and as a preservative. There was ebony, the dense black wood that came from sub-Saharan Africa, almost certainly reaching the ship through Egyptian trade networks. There were ostrich eggs, probably also from North Africa. There was a scarab bearing the name of the Egyptian queen Nefertiti, who had been dead for decades by the time the ship likely sailed, suggesting it was already an antique when someone placed it in their bag and walked aboard. There were pottery vessels from the Mycenaean palace workshops of mainland Greece. There were pottery vessels from Cyprus, the island that was then the largest copper-producing territory in the known world. There were weapons and tools associated with at least 4 or 5 distinct cultural traditions, suggesting the crew itself may have been drawn from multiple places. or that the ship had stopped at multiple ports before the one it never completed. The man who owned that cargo, whoever he was, had access to a network. That network connected Egypt. With its gold and its grain and its enormous appetite for timber and metal it could not produce at home. It connected the Hittite Empire, which controlled large parts of Anatolia and northern Syria and depended on imported tin and copper just as much as anyone else. It connected the Mycenaean palace centres of mainland Greece, those heavily fortified complexes at places like Mycenae and Tiryns and Pylos, whose scribes kept meticulous records of what came in and what went out on clay tablets pressed in a script modern scholars call Linear B. It connected Cyprus, whose copper deposits had made it a central node in metal trade for centuries. It connected the great Syrian port city of Ugarit, where merchants from half a dozen different cultural traditions lived and wrote their letters and stored their grain. This was a world of great kings who wrote to each other on clay tablets in a shared diplomatic language, who exchanged gifts and demands and complaints about shipping delays, who referred to each other as brothers even when they were not particularly friendly. It was a world of palace economies that tracked their resources obsessively, of specialized craftsmen who worked in workshops attached to royal centers, of scribes who recorded the movement of every jar of olive oil and every fleece of wool. It was, by the standards of the ancient world, extraordinarily complex, and complexity, it turned out, had a price. The Uluburun ship did not sail in a vacuum. It sailed because there were buyers at the other end who needed what it carried, and sellers at the origin who needed what those buyers could offer in return. The whole system worked because the pieces fit together across enormous distances. Cyprus needed grain. It could not grow in sufficient quantity on its rocky terrain. The Mycenaean palaces needed tin they had no local source for. Egypt needed the cedar timber of the Lebanese coast and the copper and bronze that its weapons and tools required. Every major player in this world depended on something that came from somewhere else. That dependency was not a weakness anyone would have named at the time. From the inside, it was the signature of a thriving civilization. You traded because you had something others wanted. You received because others had something you needed. The volume of exchange was a measure of prosperity. The complexity of the network was a measure of how deeply the world had been organized into something larger than any single kingdom. What no one inside that system appears to have fully understood was what would happen if the network itself began to fail. Not one part of it. Not one trade route temporarily closed by a storm or a conflict. Enough of it. Simultaneously. To prevent the compensating mechanisms from working. The ship at Uluburun sank sometime in the 14th or early 13th century BC. The collapse came roughly a century or more after the period that ship represented, the world that produced that cargo, that made it possible for a single merchant vessel to carry 10 tons of copper and tin from distant sources, and ebony from Africa and pottery from Greece, and the scarab of a dead Egyptian queen all in the same hold. That world was already moving, without knowing it, towards something it could not survive. A century sounds like a long time. In the life of a civilization, it is not very much at all. The merchants who loaded that ship did not know what was coming. The scribes who recorded the outgoing cargo at whatever port it left from had no reason to think they were living in the last chapter of something. The sailors who went down with it, if they had time to think anything at all in those final moments, probably thought about the water coming in and the cargo lost and whether anyone would know what had happened to them. No one did know. For thousands of years, the ship lay on the bottom of the sea off the cape at Uluburun, while everything that had made it possible slowly disappeared from the world above. The copper ingots did not corrode. The tin ingots did not corrode. The ebony did not rot in the cold dark water. The ceramic vessels held their shape. The scarab of Nefertiti sat in the sediment and waited. And when Mehmet Kakir came down through 30 meters of water in the summer of 1980, too, and found what was there, the world he pulled back into the light had been waiting a very long time to be seen again. That is where this story begins. Not with armies, not with the names of kings, not with the collapse itself, with a ship, and what it carried, and the world that made such a ship possible. Because you cannot understand what was lost without first understanding what was there to lose. and what was there to lose was more than anyone who lost it could have imagined. In the winter of 1887, a woman was digging in the ruins of an ancient Egyptian city. Her name has not been preserved in most accounts of what happened next, which is itself a small and familiar injustice. She was a local Egyptian woman working near the village of El Amarna, on the east bank of the Nile, in the place where the pharaoh Akhenaten had built his capital and where the sand had been slowly swallowing it ever since. She was not an archaeologist. She was digging for sebakh, the decomposed mud brick that farmers in the Nile Valley used as fertilizer. She was looking for something to put on her fields. What she found instead was a cache of clay tablets covered in small, wedge-shaped marks. She did not know what they were. Neither did the first dealers who bought them from her. For a time, some experts declared them forgeries, because what they appeared to be was too strange to accept. They appeared to be diplomatic correspondence between the royal courts of the ancient Near East, written not in Egyptian hieroglyphs, but in a script and language that had no business being found in an Egyptian city. They were not forgeries, they were the Amarna letters, and they would turn out to be one of the most important historical discoveries of the 19th century, a window into a world of international diplomacy so sophisticated and so fully formed that it forced scholars to rethink what they had assumed about how the Bronze Age actually worked. There are more than 350 tablets in the collection, most now held at the British Museum in London and the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin. They date from the reigns of the pharaohs Amenhotep III and Amenhotep IV, who took the name Akhenaten, roughly the middle of the 14th century BC. They are written in Akkadian, the language of Mesopotamia, which served as the international diplomatic language of the Bronze Age in something like the way Latin served medieval Europe. It was not the native tongue of the Egyptians who received these letters, nor of many who sent them. It was simply the language everyone agreed to use when they needed to talk to each other, and they talked to each other constantly. The letters come from the kings of Babylon and Assyria and Mitanni in the Hittite Empire. They come from local rulers and officials in Canaan and Syria and Cyprus, covering a range from great powers to smaller kingdoms and states along the Levantine coast. Together they form something that looks, once you understand what you are reading, remarkably like the correspondence of a functioning international system, not a perfect one, not a peaceful one, but a real one, with its own rules and its own rituals and its own particular frustrations. The great kings called each other brother. This was not a casual term. It was a precise diplomatic designation indicating rough equality of status. A king who wrote to the pharaoh as brother was asserting that his kingdom stood on the same level as Egypt in the hierarchy of great powers. Status was everything in this world, and language was how status was negotiated. Carefully, in every letter. Now consider what that meant in practice. The letters deal with gold. The kings of Babylon and Mitanni write repeatedly, with a frustration that comes through clearly even across 3,000 years of translation, about the quality and quantity of gold Egypt has sent them. One Babylonian king complains that the gold arrived reduced after being put in a furnace, that it was not what had been promised, that he is building a palace and needs more. The request is firm. The framing remains diplomatic, but the expectation underneath it is unmistakable. Brotherhood carries obligations, and Egypt has not met them. Sit with that for a moment. A king writing to the most powerful ruler in the known world, complaining about the quality of a gift, because the relationship they had built gave him the standing to do exactly that. This was not submission. It was a system with rules, and both sides knew the rules, and both sides held the other accountable to them. The letters deal with marriage. The great kings exchanged daughters as diplomatic instruments, sending princesses to foreign courts to seal alliances and deepen the bonds between dynasties. The negotiations around these marriages were intricate and sometimes contentious. One king questions whether the woman Egypt sent is truly a princess, whether he has been deceived, whether such deception would be consistent with the brotherhood he had been promised. Let that detail sit for a moment too. The great kingdoms of the Bronze Age were connected not just by trade but by family. by the movement of women across vast distances as living seals of political agreements. The system was not merely economic, it was human. The letters deal with physicians. A king writes, asking to borrow an Egyptian doctor, having heard they are skilled, promising to return him when finished. There is a letter mentioning a plague moving through the region, asking for healing statues to be sent. There are letters about timber and horses and lapis lazuli and copper from Cyprus and shipping delays that have gone on too long. These details matter not because they are surprising, but because of what they reveal together. This was not a world of isolated kingdoms locked inside their own borders. This was a world of rulers who tracked each other's affairs, who understood that what happened in Babylon had implications for what was possible in Egypt, and vice versa. Over centuries, the great powers of the Eastern Mediterranean had developed something like a shared framework for managing their relationships. It had its protocols and its expectations and its face, saving formulas for avoiding open conflict when direct confrontation would have been costly for everyone. It worked, imperfectly, contentiously, with constant friction, but it worked. And then, within roughly a century and a half after these letters were written, most of the kingdoms that sent and received them would be gone, not diminished, not reorganized under new management. Gone. The Hittite king, whose letters are among the most formally careful in the collection, ruled an empire that would vanish so completely that the people who came after would not know it had existed. The rulers of the Canaanite city, states whose letters mix political maneuvering with urgent requests for military support, would see their cities burned or abandoned or transformed beyond recognition. And Egypt, which received all these letters, which sat at the centre of this web of correspondence, would survive, but as something smaller and more fragile than what it had been when these tablets were pressed and fired. The letters themselves survived because they were made of clay. Clay does not burn. Clay does not rot. It sits in the ground and waits. The system those letters represented was made of something less durable. It was made of relationships and expectations, and the shared belief that the framework would hold. When that belief broke, the system broke with it. The woman digging for fertilizer in the ruins of Akhenaten's capital had no way of knowing what she had found. She was looking for something to make things grow. What she pulled out of the ground instead was the last clear record of a world that had already been gone for more than 3,000 years. The tablets were recognized, bought, catalogued, translated, studied, and what they revealed to the scholars who spent careers reading them was not just a diplomatic archive. It was a portrait of a world that worked, a world of connected kingdoms and shared languages and carefully maintained relationships, a world that believed, with every letter it wrote, that the connections it had built would hold. They did not hold. What broke them? And why the breaking was so complete that kingdoms vanished from living memory, is what this story is moving toward. There is a question worth sitting with before this story moves further. Why bronze? Not in the chemical sense. Not just the explanation that copper plus tin produces an alloy harder and more useful than either alone. Though that is true and that matters, the question worth asking is larger. Why did an entire age of human civilization take its name from a metal? Why did bronze sit at the centre of the palace economies and the trade networks and the diplomatic correspondence we have just been reading? Why did the kings in those letters care so much about copper and tin? The answer is not that bronze was precious in the way gold was precious. Bronze was not a luxury. Bronze was infrastructure. Think of a Mycenaean smith at work sometime in the 13th century BC. He is not a free craftsman working for whoever brings him business. He works in a workshop attached to a palace, and the palace knows exactly who he is. The Linear B tablets from Pylos list bronze smiths by name and location, recording how much metal each has been allocated and what each is expected to produce. His work, his tools, his output, all of it is part of a system that begins thousands of miles away, in ore deposits and trade routes he will never see, and ends in the palace storerooms that track every finished piece he makes. He lifts a piece of copper in one hand and a piece of tin in the other. Neither is useful alone. Together, under heat, they become something the whole world runs on. His hammer is bronze. The ploughshare that breaks the ground outside the city walls is bronze. The axle fittings on the cart that carries grain to the palace are bronze. The ritual vessels in the temple where the palace holds its ceremonies are bronze. The weights that merchants use to measure transactions at the harbour are bronze. In a world without iron in common use, bronze was not one material among many. It was the material that made organised society at this scale possible. Remove it, and you do not have a less well-equipped civilization. You have a different kind of civilization entirely. Smaller and simpler and less capable of everything that Bronze Age kingdoms had learned to do. And bronze had a problem. It is an alloy. It requires copper and tin together, in roughly the right proportion, smelted under sufficient heat. Copper was difficult to source but manageable. Cyprus, the island whose ancient name is the root of the modern word copper, had extensive ore deposits and was actively mining and smelting throughout the late Bronze Age. The Uluburun ship carried Cypriot copper. The Amarna letters reference Cypriot copper. Archaeologists have found Cypriot copper ingots in the distinctive oxide shape that made them easy to stack and carry. At sites stretching from Sardinia to Syria, Cyprus was, by the standards of the ancient world, a reliable and well-understood supplier. Tin was a different problem entirely. Tin does not occur in useful quantities anywhere in the eastern Mediterranean. There are no significant tin deposits in Egypt, in Janam, in Syria, in Anatolia, in Cyprus, in mainland Greece. The civilizations that built their entire material world around bronze had no local source for one of the two essential ingredients of the metal their civilization ran on. Where the tin came from is a question archaeologists and materials scientists have been working on for decades. And the honest answer is that the full picture is not yet settled. Studies of the tin ingots from the Uluburun ship have suggested that at least some may have originated in the Taurus Mountains of Anatolia, while other analyses have pointed toward possible origins in Central Asia. Some researchers have raised the possibility of sources further west. The isotopic and chemical signatures of ancient tin are difficult to match definitively to specific geological deposits, and the evidence continues to be refined with each new study. What is not in dispute is the implication, whatever the exact roots and sources. Tin was not local. It had to travel. It had to pass through intermediaries. It had to cross territories controlled by different kingdoms, handled by different merchants, loaded and unloaded at different ports. By the time a tin ingot arrived at a palace workshop, it had almost certainly passed through multiple hands across distances that would have seemed extraordinary to everyone involved in the journey. Go back to the smith at Pylos. He knows the copper. He may have seen it arrive, but the tin came from somewhere he has never been, through people he has never met, along routes that exist on no map he has ever seen. He holds both pieces of metal, puts them in the furnace, and makes something the whole world needs. He does not think about the supply chain. Why would he? It has always worked. That is the condition the Bronze Age palace economies had built themselves into. Not just weapons, not just tools. The agricultural implements that worked the fields feeding the palace populations, the fittings on the ships that carried the trade goods, the weights that merchants used to measure their transactions, the ritual objects in the temples. Everything that required bronze required a supply chain that ran through other kingdoms, other merchants, other political arrangements that had their own pressures and their own vulnerabilities. A palace administrator at Pylos could track every gram of bronze in the workshop. What that administrator could not track was whether the next tin shipment would arrive, and without the tin shipment, the tracking stopped mattering, because there was nothing left to track. The Bronze Age kingdoms had spent centuries building a world in which everything depended on everything else. The copper from Cyprus and the tin from distant sources, and the grain from Egypt and the timber from Lebanon, all fit together into a system that produced, at its peak, something genuinely remarkable. Palaces, fleets, art, diplomatic correspondence in a shared language. A level of material culture and administrative sophistication that would not be matched in the Eastern Mediterranean for several centuries after it was gone. They built that world one trade voyage at a time, one ingot, one letter. one arranged marriage at a time. They built it because it worked. What they were also building, without knowing it, was a system that had no way to protect itself from its own complexity. The smith at Pylos set down his work at the end of the day. The palace scribe updated the records. The tablet was pressed and set aside. The tin that was supposed to arrive next season would arrive. Or it would not. And the palace would manage either way, as it always had, until the day it could not. The Uluburun ship sits at the bottom of the sea off the coast of Turkey. Its copper ingots did not corrode. Its tine ingots did not corrode. The metal that was going to become bronze, that was going to become something useful in the world the ship was sailing toward, never arrived. The world it was sailing toward would not have had much use for it anyway. Not for much longer. There is a temple in southern Egypt, carved directly into a sandstone cliff on the west bank of the Nile at a place called Abu Simbel, that was built during the reign of Ramesses II. 4 enormous seated figures dominate the facade, each one roughly 20 meters tall, each bearing the same face, the face of the pharaoh who, as his inscriptions proclaimed to all who approached, had never lost a battle, never been outmatched, never faced a moment the gods did not arrange in his favour. Inside the temple, carved into the walls in careful detail, is a battle, the Battle of Kadesh, fought in the 5th year of Ramesses II's reign, around 1270, for BC, against the Hittite Empire under its king Muwatalli II. The Egyptian version of this battle, repeated across multiple temples and monuments from Abu Simbel to Luxor, is one of the most extensively documented military engagements in the ancient world. Ramesses II made certain of that. He spent decades making certain of that. In the Egyptian account, Ramesses personally turned the tide after being surrounded and nearly overwhelmed by Hittite forces. He called upon the god Amun and fought his way free and stood triumphant on the field. The inscriptions are vivid and specific. They record, in the language of divine favour and royal invincibility, a complete and decisive Egyptian victory. The Hittites kept records too. The Hittite account of the same battle describes the outcome differently. According to sources from Hattusa, the Hittite capital, the engagement at Kadesh ended without a clear victor. Both sides suffered significant losses. Both sides pulled back. Neither achieved the objectives that had brought them to that field in the first place. The truth, as best as modern historians can reconstruct it from combining Egyptian, Hittite, and archaeological evidence, is closer to the Hittite version. Kadesh was not a rout. It was a costly and inconclusive engagement between two empires that had been contesting control of the Levant for decades and had reached the point where neither could easily continue. What happened next is the most revealing part of the story. More than a decade after the battle, Ramesses II and the Hittite king Hattusili III signed a peace agreement. The text survives in multiple versions. The Egyptian version inscribed on temple walls. The Hittite version preserved on clay tablets found at Hattusa. It is among the earliest surviving international peace agreements in human history, and its contents reveal something important about the actual condition of the two powers who produced it. The agreement establishes non-aggression between Egypt and the Hittite Empire. It establishes mutual defense obligations. It establishes provisions for returning fugitives, with a clause ensuring returned individuals would not be punished harshly. It addresses succession, expressing mutual interest in the stability of each other's ruling dynasties. What the agreement does not include is a clear victor's peace. There is no territory changing hands in a direction that unambiguously favours one side. No indemnity, no acknowledgement of defeat. It reads, in both versions, as an agreement between powers who had decided that the cost of continued conflict outweighed any potential gains. Ramesses II built monuments to a victory at Kadesh. He also signed an agreement with the enemy he had supposedly defeated, on terms that acknowledged their continued power and their legitimacy as a great kingdom. The monuments and the agreement are both historical facts. They do not entirely reconcile with each other. That gap between what the monuments proclaimed and what the agreement revealed is worth holding for a moment, because it points towards something about how great empires manage the distance between their self-image and their actual condition. The inscriptions at Abu Simbel say one thing, the diplomatic reality said another, and the administrative records of the period, the less glamorous counterpart to the temple carvings, said a third thing still. Those administrative records show a state managing its obligations carefully during the reign of Ramesses II. There are records of payment delays to workers at royal construction sites. There are records of grain shortages in certain years. There are records of increasing pressure along the western delta from groups moving in from the Libyan regions. These were manageable problems in the long reign of a capable ruler, with the authority and the resources to direct attention where it was needed. But managing problems requires resources, and the resources of even a great empire have limits. The later administrative records of his reign suggest that what had once been routine pressures were requiring more sustained attention and more expenditure than they had before. The building programs were enormous. The military commitments were ongoing. The palace economy was tracking its inputs and outputs with the usual precision, but the margins were tighter than they had been a generation earlier. Ramesses II died after a reign of roughly 7 years, probably in his early 90s, having outlived 12 of his sons. The heir who succeeded him, Merneptah, inherited a kingdom that was still powerful, still capable of projecting military force across the Levant and into Libya, still one of the anchor points of the Bronze Age international system. But Merneptah's reign, which lasted roughly a decade, included an event that points toward the pressures building at the edges of that system. A large granite stele from his mortuary temple at Thebes records a military campaign in Canaan and Libya, and ends with a passage listing peoples and places he claims to have subdued. Among those names, in a passage that has generated more scholarly attention than almost any comparable inscription in Egyptology, is a name that appears to refer to a people rather than a city or a state. The name is Israel. The earliest known mention of that name in any historical record outside the Hebrew Bible, its presence on a list of defeated peoples in the late 13th century BC, is a reminder of how many different pressures Egypt was managing simultaneously during this period. The kingdom was fighting in Canaan, defending its western border against Libyan incursions, maintaining the machinery of one of the most complex states in the ancient world, all at the same time. The successors to Merneptah ruled for shorter and shorter periods. A stretch of Egyptian history following his death is marked by internal competition and shortened reigns and a general sense, readable between the lines of the administrative records, of a great kingdom managing problems that were accumulating faster than they were being solved. Ramesses III came to the throne around 1180, 4 BC. He would prove capable. He would face threats that his predecessors had not faced in quite the same form. He would survive them, and Egypt would survive with him. But the Egypt that came out the other side of what Ramesses III was about to face was not the Egypt of Ramesses II. It was not the kingdom that had carved its account of Kadesh into the living rock of a cliff in the southern desert. It was something diminished, something that had spent what it needed to spend to survive, and found that surviving had cost more than it knew it had. The new kingdom never recovered its old reach. The international system that Egypt had anchored for more than 2 centuries, the world of Amarna letters and bronze trade routes and great kings calling each other brother, would not be rebuilt. What Egypt survived into was a smaller world, organized around different principles, shaped by forces that the inscriptions at Abu Simbel had given no one any reason to anticipate. The 4 enormous figures of Ramesses II still look out across the Nile Valley at Abu Simbel. The stone has lasted more than 3,000 years. The kingdom those figures represent did not last as long as the stone, and that gap, between the permanence of what the pharaoh built and the fragility of the world he built it in, is itself a kind of lesson, not one he intended to give, not one anyone inside that world could have read clearly, but present, nonetheless. In the distance between the monument and the reality it was built to obscure, in the old form of that world, no one had the power to stop what was coming. Not Egypt. For all its gold and its grain and its 3,000 Year institutional memory, not the Hittites, for all their armies and their archives, not the palace scribes tracking every ingot and every fleece in every kingdom connected to the network, not the merchants who loaded ships like the one at Ulu Barun and expected them to arrive. The world was moving towards something none of them could see, and the next kingdom this story turns to had already reached the edge of that something and fallen through it, so completely that the world forgot it had ever been there. There is a city in the highlands of central Anatolia, in the country we now call Turkey, that was once the capital of one of the most powerful empires in the ancient world. For centuries, this city was the centre of a great kingdom that controlled large parts of Anatolia and northern Syria, that fielded armies capable of fighting Egypt to a standstill, that maintained sophisticated diplomatic correspondence with the other great powers of the Bronze Age, and that developed legal traditions and administrative systems whose complexity has impressed every scholar who has examined them. The city is called Hattusa. For most of the time, between the end of the Bronze Age and the late 19th century of our own era, almost no one in the literate world knew it had existed. That is not quite accurate in every sense. The Hebrew Bible mentions a people called the Hittites in various contexts, usually as inhabitants of Canaan or as one of the peoples of the region. Egyptian inscriptions reference the Hatti as the great northern power with whom Egypt had fought and eventually made peace. The agreement signed after Kadesh, as we have just discussed, named the Hittite king explicitly. There were references, scattered across different textual traditions, to a people who had once been significant somewhere in the ancient Near East. But what those references pointed to, what empire they described, where its capital was, what language its people spoke, what laws they lived by, none of that was known. The Hittites existed in the historical record as a name without a face. Scholars who noticed the mentions in Egyptian and biblical texts could not match them to any identified civilization. The references floated there, unattached, for centuries. The excavations that changed this began in earnest in the early years of the 20th century, when a German archaeological team started systematic work at a site called Bogazkoy in central Anatolia, roughly 150 kilometers east of the modern Turkish capital of Ankara. What they found there, and what subsequent generations of archaeologists have continued to uncover in the centuries since, is one of the most significant bodies of ancient material ever recovered from the ground. The archive at Hattusa contained more than 30,000 clay tablets, written in Hittite, in Akkadian, and in several other languages used by the empire's diverse population. These tablets include legal codes, diplomatic correspondence, religious texts, mythology, administrative records, and the treaties and annals of Hittite kings. They revealed a civilization of genuine complexity, one that had developed nuanced approaches to law, to interstate relations, to religious practice, and to the administration of a large and ethnically diverse empire. Among the tablets found at Hattusa was the Hittite version of the agreement with Ramesses II. The document that Egypt had inscribed on temple walls appeared here on clay, in the Hittite language, preserved in the imperial archive. Two great powers, two versions of the same agreement, both surviving, separated by more than 1,000 kilometers and more than 3,000 years, each side keeping its own record of the same moment, the same negotiation, the same acknowledgement that the cost of continued conflict had exceeded whatever either side stood to gain. The Hittite Empire at its peak stretched from the Aegean coast of Anatolia in the west to the upper reaches of the Euphrates River in the east, and from the Black Sea coast in the north to the mountains of Lebanon in the south. It was not a monolithic structure. It was a collection of vassal kingdoms and directly administered territories held together by a combination of military force, treaty obligations, and the prestige of the Hittite Great King. Different parts of the empire had different degrees of autonomy. Some vassal kings had considerable independence. Others were kept in place by Hittite garrisons and administrators who reported directly to Hattusa. This structure had worked, more or less, for centuries. It had survived succession crises and internal rebellions and military defeats and the loss and recovery of territory. The Hittite Empire was not a fragile thing in any simple sense. It had demonstrated, across its history, a considerable capacity for recovery and adaptation. What happened to it at the end of the Bronze Age was not a gradual decline that scholars can trace clearly through a sequence of recoverable events. What happened was something more abrupt and, in historical terms, more puzzling. The last known Hittite king was a ruler named Suppiluliuma II, who came to the throne sometime in the early 12th century BC. The records of his reign that survive are fragmentary. They describe military activities, including what appears to have been a naval engagement in the waters off Cyprus, which would have been unusual for a land-based empire, and may reflect an attempt to secure resources or trade routes already under threat. There are references in those records to enemies and to difficulties that the scribes describe without fully explaining, and then the records stop, not gradually, not with a long sequence of increasingly desperate accounts of a kingdom fighting for survival. The administrative records of the Hittite Empire simply end. The great archive at Hattusa, which had been continuously maintained for generations, was not updated anymore. The city itself shows evidence of destruction by fire. Some areas appear to have been abandoned before the destruction. The population did not leave a written account of what happened, or if they did, it has not survived. Hattusa was not rebuilt. This is perhaps the single most significant fact about the end of the Hittite Empire. Cities sacked by enemies are sometimes rebuilt. Cities that lose their economic reason for existing may be abandoned gradually over generations. But Hattusa was neither gradually abandoned nor quickly rebuilt. It was destroyed, or partially destroyed and partially abandoned. And the site was not resettled as an urban centre of comparable scale for a very long time afterward. The empire that had centred on Hattusa did not transfer to a new capital. There was no successor state that continued the Hittite imperial tradition in a new location. What followed the disappearance of the imperial centre was fragmentation. The Neo-Hittite kingdoms, as scholars call them, are an important part of this story and deserve to be named clearly. In Syria and in the southeastern regions of Anatolia, communities that had been part of the Hittite Empire or its cultural sphere continued to exist in the centuries following the collapse. They used Hittite languages and preserved elements of Hittite culture and religion. They are attested in Assyrian records and in other sources from the early 1st millennium BC. They were real, and they were not insignificant, but they were not the Hittite Empire. They were fragments. The administrative system centered on Hattusa, the network of vassal relationships coordinated by the great king, the archive that recorded the laws and treaties and correspondence of a great power, the machinery of imperial rule itself. That was gone. The Neo-Hittite kings ruled in the Hittite cultural tradition the way that local lords in post. Roman Britain ruled in the shadow of an empire that was no longer there. The shadows remained. The empire did not. What had caused this? The honest answer is that we do not fully know. And the uncertainty is not for lack of evidence, but because the evidence we have points in multiple directions without converging cleanly. There is evidence of destruction at Hattusa, but the cause of that destruction is debated. There is evidence of population movement in the region during the late 13th and early 12th centuries BC. There are references in some of the last Hittite documents to food shortages and requests for grain, which may indicate that drought and disrupted trade were already affecting the empire before whatever final event ended its existence. The Hittite Empire collapsed. Its capital was destroyed or abandoned. Its administrative system ended. Its archive fell silent. And for most of the time that followed, the people who came after simply did not know the Hittites had been there. The tablets sat in the ground at Hattusa. The inscriptions on the temple walls of Egypt mentioned the Hatti, without anyone being able to say with confidence who the Hatti actually were. The agreement between Ramesses II and Hattusili III, that careful document negotiated by two great kings trying to manage their rivalry without destroying each other, lay unread in the archive at Hattusa, under the soil of Anatolia for more than 3,000 years. Empire fall. That is one of the things empires do. But there is a difference between falling and being forgotten. The Hittites crossed both lines. Rome fell. And no one forgot Rome. The Assyrian Empire collapsed. And its memory survived in biblical texts and in the historical traditions of the peoples it had conquered. The Hittites fell, and the world forgot them so thoroughly that their rediscovery felt, to the scholars who accomplished it, like finding something that had never been lost before because no one had known to look for it. The tablets were in the ground the whole time. The archive was waiting. Everything that would eventually allow historians to reconstruct the Hittite world was preserved. Accidentally. In the earth. What was not preserved was the memory, the chain of transmission that carries knowledge from one generation to the next, through texts and through institutions, and through the practices of communities that remember what came before. That chain broke completely. The Hittite Empire did not decline into obscurity over centuries. It ended, and then it was gone from living memory, as though it had never been. And the Hittite Empire did not collapse alone. There is a hill on the Syrian coast, a few kilometers north of the modern city of Latakia, that local people had always called Ras Shamra. The name means fennel head in Arabic, a quiet and unremarkable name for a place that turned out to contain one of the most significant archaeological sites in the ancient Near East. The excavations began in 1929, when a French archaeological team led by Claude Schaeffer started working the mound. What they found under the hill of Ras Shamra was a city that had been buried for more than 3,000 years. The city was Ugarit. It had been occupied, in various forms, for thousands of years before it reached the height of its prosperity in the Late Bronze Age. By the 14th and 13th centuries BC, Ugarit was one of the most important port cities on the eastern Mediterranean coast. It sat at the intersection of trade routes connecting Egypt and Canaan to the south, the Hittite Empire, and the interior of Anatolia to the north, Cyprus and the Aegean world to the west, and Mesopotamia to the east. Ships from half a dozen different cultural traditions docked in its harbour. Merchants from Egypt and Canaan and Cyprus and the Aegean maintained houses and warehouses in its quarters. Its scribes wrote in at least 7 different languages, including a local script called Ugaritic that was among the earliest alphabetic writing systems in the ancient world. Ugarit was not simply a trading post. It was a city with a palace, with temples, with a residential quarter of considerable density, with craftsmen and administrators and priests and merchants and sailors and all the other categories of people. A functioning urban centre required. Its king corresponded with the great powers of the age, receiving letters from the pharaoh and from the Hittite great king, navigating the pressures of a small kingdom that sat between much larger ones and had to manage its relationships with all of them at the same time. At its peak, Ugarit was wealthy in the way that port cities at the intersection of major trade routes tend to be wealthy. It took something from everything that passed through it. It offered services that travellers and merchants needed. It was, in the language that economic historians use, a hub, and like all hubs, it was valuable precisely because so much passed through it, and vulnerable for exactly the same reason. When Claude Schaeffer and his team began uncovering the city, they found something that archaeologists working on ancient sites encounter only rarely. Evidence not of gradual decline or slow abandonment, but of abrupt ending. Buildings that had been in active use, storage rooms that still contained their contents, an archive that held its tablets where they had been left, not sorted and organised for preservation, but simply present, as though whoever had been managing them expected to return and had not. The destruction layer at Ugarit is one of the most dramatic in the archaeology of the Late Bronze Age. There is evidence of fire. There is evidence of structures collapsing. There are broken objects in positions that suggest they were dropped rather than placed. The material record of the city's final period has the quality of an interruption rather than a conclusion. And among the ruins, there were the tablets. Some of them were preserved precisely because of the fire that destroyed the city. Clay tablets are vulnerable to water and to time in their unfired state, but intense heat transforms them, baking them hard in the same way that deliberate firing produces durable ceramics. The conflagration that ended Ugarit accidentally preserved a portion of its final archive, fixing the city's last communications in a form that would survive 3,000 years of burial. Among the texts recovered from Ugarit's final period are messages dealing with a threat from the sea. The precise details of the surviving correspondence are reconstructed from tablets in varying states of preservation, and scholars have debated the exact sequence and interpretation of the documents. But the general picture that emerges is of a city that knew something was wrong, that was attempting to communicate its situation to others, and that did not survive long enough to receive meaningful help. Some of the surviving texts from this period, as preserved and translated by researchers, describe what appear to be enemy ships off the coast and attacks on the surrounding territory. The language conveys urgency. Other texts from administrative centres elsewhere in the region acknowledge receiving word of trouble and offer some form of response, though whether that response ever reached its destination is not clear from what has survived. What is clear from the archaeological record is that Ugarit was not resettled after its destruction. This is the fact that separates it most sharply from other ancient cities that were attacked and burned and then rebuilt. The harbour that had seen ships from a dozen cultures fill it with cargo sat empty. The warehouses that had stored the goods of the ancient world's most connected trade network held nothing. The scribes who had written in 7 languages had no successors at this site. The hill of Ras Shamra went back to being a hill. The city beneath accumulated the sediment of centuries. The tablets baked hard by the fire sat in the darkness and waited. There is a particular quality to the objects found in a city that ended this way, as opposed to a city that declined gradually over generations. When a city is abandoned slowly, people take things with them. They carry away what is valuable. They sort through what remains. But when a city ends suddenly, the record left behind is a snapshot. It shows you what was there and what was happening. At the moment the ending came, the tablets of Ugarit are a snapshot of a city that was functioning and then was not. The merchant accounts and the administrative records and the diplomatic correspondence and the letters that were being composed or received in the moments before the end, all of it preserved in the fire's accidental archive, shows a place that had not finished its business, that had more things to do, that expected a tomorrow that did not come, the tragedy that scholars and readers return to, the detail that carries the most weight across 3,000 years of distance, is not the destruction itself. Cities were destroyed in the ancient world. That was a fact of ancient life. Brutal and common. The tragedy is something quieter. The clay that held the words outlasted the hands that pressed them. The texts asking for help are still here. The help, if it was sent, did not arrive in time. The city that needed it is gone, and the tablets, baked hard by the fire that ended the life of the city, have been read by more people in the 20th and 21st centuries than they were probably ever intended to reach. That is what the fire preserved. Not the city, not the community, not the trade network or the harbour or the life that filled all of those things with meaning. The words, the last communications of a city that did not know they would be its last. And among those words, the image that remains most clearly is of messages being sent and not answered, of a city reaching out to the network it had always been part of, asking the network to hold, and finding that the network was no longer there to hold it. On the walls of a mortuary temple on the west bank of the Nile, at a place called Medinet Habu, carved in stone during the reign of Ramesses III in the early 12th century BC, there are scenes of battle unlike anything recorded in Egyptian art before them. Egyptian military art had a long tradition by the time these scenes were carved. Pharaohs had been depicted conquering enemies since the earliest dynasties. The conventions were established and familiar, the pharaoh large and commanding, his enemies small and falling beneath him. The enemy clearly identified by clothing and physical features as foreign and therefore defeated. The Medinet Habu reliefs follow some of these conventions, but they also show something that the earlier tradition had not needed to show. They show a naval battle. Egyptian ships and enemy ships engaged in close combat on open water. They show land battles involving not just enemy warriors but what appear to be families travelling with possessions and children, using ox carts of a type not associated with Egypt's traditional enemies. They show a people on the move. not simply an army attacking, but something that looks more like a migration under arms, a population displacing itself toward Egyptian territory. The accompanying inscriptions identify the groups involved by name. Among the names as transliterated from Egyptian are the Peliset, the Cheka, the Shekelesh, the Denyen, and the Weshesh. The inscriptions describe these groups as having come from the sea and from islands, having swept through the northern regions, having destabilized or destroyed a series of named places including Hatti, Azava, and Al-Ashia, before pressing toward Egypt. Ramesses III claims to have defeated them decisively. The reliefs show the aftermath of victory, captured enemies presented before the pharaoh, the familiar iconography of Egyptian triumph. These groups, taken together, are what modern scholars call the Sea Peoples, and almost everything about them, beyond the basic fact of their presence in the Egyptian record, is contested. The name itself is a modern scholarly convenience, not an ancient one. The Egyptians did not use a single term to describe all these groups together. They named them separately and dealt with them as distinct problems. It is modern historians who have grouped them under the umbrella term Sea Peoples, which is useful for discussion but can create a misleading impression of unity that the ancient record does not support. Who were they? Where did they come from? These questions have been debated since the late 19th century and have not been definitively answered. The difficulty is not lack of interest or lack of effort. The difficulty is that the evidence is genuinely ambiguous, and the interpretive choices scholars make in approaching it tend to reflect larger assumptions about how the Bronze Age collapse happened. Various proposals have been made about the origins of the different groups named in the Egyptian texts. The Peliset have often been identified with the Philistines, who appear in biblical texts as inhabitants of the southern Levantine coast in the early Iron Age. The Shekelesh have been connected by some researchers to groups associated with Sicily or the central Mediterranean, though this identification remains speculative and is not broadly accepted among specialists. These proposals are suggestive at best, and for most of them the evidence is interpreted differently by different researchers working from the same material. What the archaeological record does show is that in the decades around 1200 BC, there was significant population movement across the eastern Mediterranean. Sites in the Aegean world and in Cyprus show evidence of new cultural elements arriving from outside, alongside evidence of disruption to the existing order. A pottery style associated with Aegean traditions appears at sites along the Levantine coast during this period, which many archaeologists read as evidence of people moving from the Aegean world into the eastern Mediterranean, though the direction and nature of that movement are interpreted differently by different researchers. The deeper question, and the one with the most significance for understanding the Bronze Age collapse, is whether the Sea Peoples were a cause of the collapse or a consequence of it. The traditional view, which dominated scholarship for much of the 20th century, treated the Sea Peoples as a primary cause. In this reading, waves of migrants and raiders swept through the eastern Mediterranean, destroying the palace centres, destabilizing the trade networks, and bringing down the Bronze Age world through military force. This explanation had the appeal of clarity. It named an agent. It described a mechanism. It fit the dramatic evidence from Medinet Habu. The problems with this view accumulated over decades of further research. The timeline did not always fit. Some destructions appeared to predate the period when the Sea Peoples were most clearly attested. Some sites showed patterns of abandonment that an invasion model could not straightforwardly explain. And the question of where the Sea Peoples came from, of why so many people were moving at the same time, began to suggest that the movement itself was a symptom of something larger. The possibility that has gained increasing attention is that at least some of the groups the Egyptians called Sea Peoples were themselves products of the collapse rather than its cause. If the palace economies of the Aegean and the Anatolian coast were already failing, already unable to sustain the populations that depended on them, then the movement of people away from those failing centres toward regions that might still offer resources and opportunities would be exactly what you would expect. When fields fail and institutions fail with them, people move. They move toward wherever survival seems possible. In this reading, What Egypt saw arriving from the sea was not a coordinated invasion following a plan of conquest. It was movement following the only logic available to people whose world had ended, heading away from catastrophe and toward whatever remained. This does not mean the sea peoples were passive or peaceful. People moving under conditions of desperation can be extremely dangerous. The violence recorded in the Egyptian inscriptions and visible in the destruction layers at sites along the Levantine coast was real. Whatever the ultimate causes of that violence, the violence itself was not imaginary, but it does shift the question. The more illuminating inquiry is not who were the sea peoples and what did they do, it is what happened to make so many people move at the same time, from so many different places, toward the same coasts. There is also a political dimension to the Egyptian account, worth naming directly. Ramesses III had significant incentives to frame the events of his reign in terms of a great external threat successfully defeated. An external enemy is the kind of threat a pharaoh can be shown to overcome. The reliefs at Medinet Habu show exactly that. The pharaoh large and commanding, defeating the chaotic forces from the sea. The narrative of external threat and royal victory was well established in Egyptian royal tradition. It was a story the system knew how to tell. The less legible story is of an empire managing the downstream effects of a systemic collapse that had multiple causes and no single villain. That story does not fit onto temple walls. It has no triumphant moment, no clear enemy defeated, no victory to carve in stone. History recorded the visible edge. It is quieter about everything that bent the world until it broke. There is a gate at the ancient citadel of Mycenae, in the northeastern Peloponnese of mainland Greece, that has stood for more than 3,000 years. Two lions carved in limestone face each other above the lintel, their front paws resting on a central column, their heads, which were made separately and have not survived. Once looking outward at whoever approached, the gate is massive. The stonework is massive. The blocks that form the walls of the citadel are so large that when people in the classical period of Greek history looked at those walls, they concluded they must have been built by giants. They called the construction Cyclopean. The Cyclops of Greek mythology were enormous creatures of superhuman strength. The Greeks of the 5th and 4th centuries BC, the Greeks of Socrates and Plato and the Parthenon, looked at the walls of Mycenaean tyrants and genuinely believed that only a creature of mythological power could have moved stones that size. They had no other explanation, because they had no memory of the people who had actually built them, the civilization that raised those walls, that carved that gate, that built the palace complexes whose ruins still cover the hilltop at Mycenae, had been gone for so long by the classical period that it had passed entirely out of historical memory and into myth. The Greeks of the 5th century BC did not know that their ancestors had once commanded palace economies that tracked hundreds of workers and thousands of units of agricultural produce. They did not know that those ancestors had written in a script called Linear B that recorded the movement of wool and grain and bronze in meticulous administrative detail. They did not know that the palace centres of their own peninsula had once participated in the same international trade network that connected Egypt to the Hittites, to Cyprus, to Ugarit. They had stories. They had the tradition of heroes who had sailed to Troy, who had fought for 10 years under the walls of a great city, who had returned home to kingdoms whose names the poems preserved. Mycenae itself, the seat of Agamemnon who led the Greek forces at Troy in those stories, is described in the tradition as rich in gold, as a powerful kingdom with a great king, but by the time those poems were performed and eventually written down, Mycenae had been a ruin for centuries. The gold, rich kingdom of the poems was a memory so old it had become indistinguishable from legend. The Mycenaean civilization, as modern archaeology has come to understand it, reached its peak in the period from roughly the 14th to the late 13th century BC, overlapping almost exactly with the period of the Amarna letters and the Uluburun ship and the agreement after Kadesh. This was the period when the great palace centres at Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos, and other sites in mainland Greece were at their most elaborate and most active. The palaces were not simply royal residences, They were administrative and economic centers that organized and managed the production and distribution of goods across their surrounding territories. The Linear B tablets, which survive in significant numbers from Pylos and in smaller quantities from other sites, show a bureaucratic machinery of considerable sophistication. There are records of land tenure, recording who held which plots and under what obligations. There are records of personnel, listing workers by category and location. There are records of livestock, of textile production, of bronze smiths and their metal allocations, of rowers assigned to ships, of offerings made to specific deities at specific sanctuaries. The gods named in the Linear B tablets include names that any reader of classical Greek literature would recognize. Zeus appears, Hera appears, Poseidon appears. With particular prominence at Pylos, Dionysus appears, which surprised scholars who had assumed from classical sources that his cult was a later arrival in the Greek world. The religious landscape of Mycenaean Greece was not identical to that of classical Greece, but it was recognizably related, a demonstration that some of what the later Greeks believed and practiced had roots extending back before the gap, before the centuries of silence that separated the Mycenaean world from the classical one. The Mycenaean world was connected to the larger Bronze Age network in ways the Linear B records make visible. Mycenaean pottery has been found across the eastern Mediterranean, at sites in Cyprus, in the Levant, in Egypt, in Anatolia. The Uluburun ship carried Mycenaean pottery. The palace economy at Pylos was importing bronze and allocating it to smiths who produced finished goods, which required a supply chain for raw materials that connected Pylos to the wider world. And then, in the late 13th century BC, the palace system collapsed. The destructions at the Mycenaean palace centres are among the most studied events in Bronze Age archaeology, and among the most debated. The evidence is clear that something catastrophic happened at most of the major palace sites within a relatively short period, though the exact dates and the nature of the events at each site vary. Pylos shows evidence of preparation before its destruction, including records of men being sent to coastal watch positions, which suggests the palace administration was aware of a threat from the sea and was attempting to respond. The palace at Pylos burned. The archive that recorded all that meticulous administrative detail was preserved in the same way the tablets of Ugarit were preserved, baked hard by the fire that ended the institution that had produced them. Mycenaean tyrants show evidence of destruction followed by some continued occupation at a reduced level. The picture across the Mycenaean world is not uniform. Different sites had different experiences. What the evidence converges on, across all the variation in detail, is this. By some time in the 12th century BC, the palace system of Mycenaean Greece was over. The administrative machinery that had tracked every fleece of wool and every unit of bronze was silent. The scribes who had written in Linear B were gone, and no one replaced them. The script disappeared. What followed is what archaeologists call the Greek Dark Ages, a term that has been debated in recent scholarship but that captures something real about the period. People continued to live in Greece. They continued to farm and raise animals and build houses and practice religion and tell stories. But the archaeological record for this period is dramatically thinner than what came before. Settlement sizes shrank. The evidence of long, distance trade nearly disappears. The sophisticated pottery styles of the late Bronze Age gave way to simpler forms, and there was no writing. For roughly 3 centuries, Greece produced no written records that have survived. The transmission of knowledge, of history, of the stories of what had happened, depended entirely on oral tradition. Stories were told and retold and passed from one generation to the next, without the anchor of written text to keep them stable. By the time writing returned to Greece, in the form of an alphabetic script adapted from Phoenician tradition, the Mycenaean world was 4 centuries gone. What the Greeks of the 8th century BC knew about the world before the gap was what the oral tradition had preserved, filtered and shaped by centuries of telling, stripped of the administrative detail the Linear B scribes had recorded, and keeping only what was vivid enough to survive in the memory of people who could not write it down. What survived was heroes. What survived was Troy. What survived was the emotional truth of a world that had been powerful and was gone, rendered into poetry because poetry was what memory could hold when there was nothing else to hold it in. The scholars who decoded Linear B in the 1950s were able to read for the first time what the Mycenaean world had actually looked like from the inside. They found not heroes but administrators, not the world of the epic tradition but the world of palace records, of wool allocations and bronze distributions and personnel rosters. The gap between those two worlds, between the administrative reality and the heroic legend, is itself a measure of what 3 centuries of oral transmission without writing had done to memory. The Cyclopean walls of Mycenae were built by people with large quantities of organized labor and considerable engineering knowledge. People who understood leverage and the management of heavy materials at scale. They were not built by giants, but the Greeks who looked at those walls and concluded they must have been were not wrong about the most important thing. They were right that whatever had built those walls was something their world could not have built. They were right that something had once been there that was gone. They just had no way of knowing what it had actually been. And that distance between what the Mycenaean world actually was and what later memory made of it is one of the most telling measures of how complete the collapse was. It was complete enough to erase not just the civilization but the knowledge that the civilization had existed. It left walls too large for later people to explain. And the only explanation their world could offer was myth. When a civilization has to be explained by invoking giants, it has been forgotten thoroughly enough that its loss is beyond ordinary measure. The argument about the Bronze Age collapse has been conducted, for most of the time since scholars began seriously investigating it, primarily through texts, the Amarna letters, the Medinet Habu inscriptions, the last tablets from Ugarit, the administrative records of the Mycenaean palaces, the annals of Hittite kings. These are the sources that dominate the historical conversation, because they are the sources that speak most directly, that name names and describe events and give us something to read. But there is another kind of evidence. It does not speak in words. It does not name the people who made it or describe the events it records. It simply exists, in layers, in the ground, at site after site across the eastern Mediterranean, and what it shows is sometimes more unambiguous than anything the text can tell us. Archaeology works through stratigraphy, the study of layers. When people live in a place over long periods of time, they build on top of what came before. They deposit their garbage and their broken objects and their fallen structures, and over time these deposits accumulate into layers that can be read, with appropriate care and training, like the pages of a very slow book. Each layer represents a period of occupation. The objects in each layer, their styles and materials and origins, tell you something about who was there and what they were doing and where they were connected to. And sometimes, between one layer and the next, there is something that is neither occupation nor object. There is burning. A destruction layer is what archaeologists call it, with the careful neutrality of a discipline that tries not to read more into evidence than the evidence supports. It is a stratum that contains charred material, ash, burned architectural elements, objects broken or melted by heat, the physical signature of a fire intense enough to destroy whatever was there. Above the destruction layer is whatever came after. Below it is whatever came before. At many sites across the region that had been the heart of the late Bronze Age world, archaeologists, working through the 20th century and into the 20th, first have encountered evidence of disruption dating to the same general period. The decades around 1200 BC and the century or so following, the sites are not all the same. The evidence at each is not identical in character. Some show evidence of violent attack. Some show evidence of fire without clear signs of the kind of conflict that leaves broken weapons and unburied bodies. Some show evidence of abandonment rather than destruction, a gradual thinning of occupation rather than a sudden end. The pattern varies, and the variation matters, but across the full range of sites, from the Greek mainland to the Aegean Islands to Cyprus to the Levantine coast, a common picture emerges, not of identical events, but of a widespread and roughly contemporaneous disruption that changed the world these places had been part of. At Mycenae on the Greek mainland, the palace on the hilltop was destroyed. Some occupation continued in the citadel afterward, but the administrative centre that had been the heart of the palace economy was gone. At Tyrins, destruction followed by reduced occupation. At Pylos, destruction and abandonment. The palace that had been sending men to coastal watch positions in its final administrative documents was burned, and no one rebuilt it. Moving east, the picture continues. At sites in Cyprus, including the major centre of economies, there is evidence of destruction in this period, followed in some cases by rebuilding and in other cases by abandonment. The copper, producing infrastructure of the island, one of the key nodes in the late Bronze Age metal trade, was disrupted at Ugarit on the Syrian coast, as we have already discussed. Destruction and no rebuilding. At sites further south along the Levantine coast, a mixed picture of destruction, abandonnement, and in some cases continuation at a reduced level. The physical evidence of reduction is visible not only in what is found at sites, but in where sites are found at all. Settlement surveys across regions of Greece that had been relatively densely occupied in the late Bronze Age show a marked decrease in the number of occupied sites in the period following the collapse. This is not simply a change in where people lived. It appears to reflect a genuine reduction in population, or at minimum, a dramatic change in how populations organize themselves. From nucleated settlements that left clear archaeological signatures to more dispersed patterns of habitation that are harder to detect and harder to quantify. There is a particular site in mainland Greece that illustrates the character of this ending with unusual clarity. The palace at Pylos, excavated primarily by the American archaeologist Carl Blegan beginning in the 1930s, is one of the best preserved Mycenaean palace sites and the one that produced the largest archive of Linear B tablets. The palace burned sometime in the late 13th or early 12th century BC by most estimates. The fire was intense enough to bake the tablets in the archive and preserve them for thousands of years. After the fire, the site was not reoccupied as a palace. There is some evidence of activity in the area in subsequent periods, but nothing that resembles the administrative complex that had existed before. The scribes were gone. The warehouse for storing goods was gone. The great hall where the king had received guests and conducted the ceremonial life of a Bronze Age palace was a ruin. What Carl Blegan and his team found when they excavated the site was, in a sense, the palace as it had been on the day it burned. The tablets were in the archive room. The storage vessels were in the storerooms. The frescoes that had decorated the walls were in fragments where they had fallen. The objects that had not been removed, that had not been carried away by people with time to carry things away, were still there. It is one of the most evocative situations in the ancient world. A place preserved at its last moment, a civilization visible at the instant of its ending. The ground does not tell us why Pylos burned. It does not name the people who burned it or describe the circumstances that led to the fire. The tablets that were preserved by the fire record the palace's administrative activities in its final period, but do not record the collapse itself. Because the scribes who kept the records were not keeping records of their own destruction. What the ground tells us is that the palace existed, that it was functioning, that it ended suddenly and incompletely, leaving its objects behind. What the ground tells us, at Pylos and at Ugarit and at Mycenae and at site after site across the region, is that something happened in a compressed period of time that changed the world these places had been part of so completely that nothing like what they had been appeared again in their locations. That is what the ground tells us. It does not tell us enough. It never tells us enough. But it tells us that the collapse was real, and that it was physical, and that it left marks in the earth that thousands of years have not erased. The ash is still there. The broken pottery is still there. The tablets baked by fires that ended everything are still there. In museums and in the photographs of archaeologists, holding their information in the particular stillness of things that have outlasted the world that made them. The question of why is still open. The fact of what happened is not There is a kind of evidence that does not come from archives or from palace storerooms or from the careful excavation of destruction layers. It comes from places that were never part of any civilization, that were never administered or recorded or built upon. It comes from the bottom of lakes, and from the rings inside ancient trees, and from the accumulated sediment of seafloors that have been collecting material, layer by layer, for thousands of years without anyone noticing or caring. This evidence does not speak in words. It does not name kings or describe battles or record the price of copper. It records something older and more fundamental than any of those things. It records what the climate was doing. The science of reconstructing past climates from physical proxies has developed significantly over the past several decades, and its application to the question of the Bronze Age collapse has added a dimension to the picture that the textual and archaeological evidence alone could not provide. It has not resolved the debate. Nothing has resolved the debate, but what it shows is worth sitting with carefully, because it points toward pressures that no scribe at Ugarit or Pylos would have had the tools to name, even as those pressures were working against every system those scribes were trying to maintain. Trees grow in annual rings, in years of good rainfall and favourable temperatures. The rings are wide. In years of drought or cold, the rings are narrow. Ancient trees, or beams of ancient timber, preserved in archaeological contexts, carry within them a record of the climatic conditions experienced year by year across their lifetimes. By cross, referencing the patterns from multiple trees of overlapping ages, researchers have been able to construct chronologies that extend back thousands of years with considerable precision. The tree ring records from the eastern Mediterranean region, including ancient timber from Anatolia and from sites in the Levant, show a pattern in the centuries around 1200 BC that has attracted significant scholarly attention. There is evidence, in the ring sequences, of years with unusually narrow growth, years that suggest drought or climatic stress, concentrated in a period that overlaps with the collapse of the Bronze Age palace systems. The lake sediment evidence points in a similar direction. Lakes accumulate sediment on their floors continuously, and the composition of that sediment changes with the conditions of the surrounding landscape. Pollen preserved in lake sediments tells you what vegetation was growing in the area, which is itself an indicator of climate. Chemical signatures in the sediment record temperature and precipitation. Cores drilled from lake sediment in the eastern Mediterranean region, including work at sites in the Dead Sea Basin and in Anatolia, have shown evidence of reduced precipitation and increased aridity during the late 2nd millennium BC. Marine sediment cores from the eastern Mediterranean have added further data. The composition of microscopic organisms in ocean sediments changes with sea surface temperatures and with the mixing of water masses, both of which are influenced by climate. Analysis of these cores has suggested changes in eastern Mediterranean climate during the period in question. Though the interpretation of marine cores involves its own complexities and uncertainties, and the evidence continues to be refined. A study published in the Journal of Archaeological Science by Brandon Drake in 2012 examined multiple lines of paleoclimatic evidence and concluded that the eastern Mediterranean experienced a shift toward drier and cooler conditions in the late 2nd millennium BC, with the most pronounced changes occurring in the period broadly associated with the Bronze Age collapse. Drake's analysis drew on pollen records, lake-level data, and other proxies to argue that the evidence for regional climate stress was significant enough to warrant serious consideration as a contributing factor in what happened. Subsequent research has both supported and complicated this picture. Some studies have found evidence of drought conditions consistent with Drake's conclusions. Others have raised questions about the precision of the dating, about whether the climatic changes were synchronous across the region or varied in timing and intensity from place to place, and about the magnitude of the changes relative to earlier periods of climatic stress that the Bronze Age world had managed to survive. The current weight of evidence suggests that regional climate stress was a real pressure during this period, while the exact extent and severity of that stress, and its relationship to the timing of specific events, remains a matter of active investigation and refinement. What the textual evidence adds to this is significant. Among the surviving documents from Ugarit and from other sites in the Levantine region during the late 13th and early 12th centuries BC, there are references to food shortages and to requests for grain. Some texts from this period, as preserved and translated by researchers, describe serious need and requests for assistance with sustenance from neighbouring powers. Egyptian texts from the reign of Merneptah mention providing grain to the Hittites, consistent with a picture of a period when agricultural production in parts of the region was under real and sustained pressure. The textual and physical evidence point in the same direction, toward a period of genuine difficulty in the food supply of the interconnected world that the Bronze Age had built. These references do not prove that climate stress caused the collapse. A single bad harvest, or even several in a row, does not by itself bring down a civilization. The Bronze Age palace economies had mechanisms for managing agricultural variability. They stored grain precisely because harvests were not perfectly predictable. They maintained records of stocks and distributions because managing the relationship between production and consumption was a central function of palace administration. The question is not whether the evidence for climate stress during this period is real. That evidence is real, though its full extent and precise timing are still being refined. The question is what that stress meant within the specific context of the late Bronze Age system, and whether the system was equipped to absorb the kind of pressure it was experiencing. In a system functioning normally, the compensating mechanisms would have helped. Egypt's grain surplus, enormous by ancient standards, could in principle have offset shortages elsewhere. Trade networks could have redirected resources. The diplomatic framework of the great kings could have coordinated responses. These capacities had worked before, in earlier periods of stress, and they had kept the system running. But the evidence suggests that by the time the climatic stress was most acute, the compensating mechanisms were themselves under pressure. The trade networks were already disrupted. The diplomatic framework was already straining. The palace economies that might have managed the agricultural stress were themselves the institutions experiencing collapse. This is where the evidence from the ground connects to the larger question of why the system failed when it did. A period of climate stress that hit a fully functional, interconnected Bronze Age world might have been managed. At cost. Through the mechanisms that world had developed for exactly that kind of challenge. A period of climate stress that hit a world whose mechanisms were already failing, whose trade networks were already disrupted, whose palace administrations were already under pressure from multiple directions, was a different kind of event entirely. The tree rings do not know this. The lake sediments do not know this. They simply record what the climate was doing, with the patient indifference of physical processes that have no interest in the civilizations they affect. But the people living through those years knew something was wrong, even if they could not have articulated why the normal responses were not working the way they were supposed to. The scribes at Ugarit who wrote the letters asking for grain knew that the grain was not coming. The administrators who managed the grain stores of the great kingdoms knew the requests were more numerous and more urgent than they had been before. None of them would have had the information to see the full picture, to understand that the stress they were experiencing was affecting not just their own territory, but regions across the whole connected world on which they depended. They saw their part of the problem. The full shape of it was too large for any single vantage point to encompass. That is one of the characteristic features of systemic collapse. It looks different from inside than it does from outside. From inside, you see your specific problems, your grain shortage, your disrupted trade route, your frontier under pressure. You deal with those specific problems as best you can. You write letters. You request help. You make decisions based on the information available to you. What you cannot see, from inside, is that the people you are writing to are managing their own versions of the same problem. That the help you are requesting is not coming not because of indifference, but because the system that would have delivered it is failing at the other end as well. The evidence in the earth records the climate. The letters in the archive record the responses of people who could not see the whole picture. Together, they sketch the outline of something that was too large and too interconnected to be visible to anyone living through it. The evidence for climate stress during this period is real. Its role in the collapse was real. And it was not the whole story. Return for a moment to the ship at Uluburun. It is sitting at the bottom of the sea off the Turkish coast. As it has been sitting for thousands of years, the copper ingots are there, 10 tons of them, shaped into the flat rectangles with 4 handles that Bronze Age merchants used because the shape made them easy to stack and carry. The tin ingots are there. The large ceramic storage vessels are there. The Mycenaean pottery, the ebony, the scarab of a queen who had been dead for decades when someone put it in their bag and walked aboard. All of it is there. None of it reached its destination. When archaeologists first began to understand what the Uluburun cargo represented, the picture it painted was one of extraordinary connection. A single ship carrying goods from 7 or more different sources, moving through a world integrated enough that such a cargo was a normal business proposition, that someone had assembled it and financed it and expected to sell it at a profit at the other end. The ship was evidence of a world that worked. It is still evidence of that, but it is also, if you look at it from a different angle, evidence of something else. It is evidence of a world that had no backup. Think about what it would have meant for the palace workshop at the other end of that voyage to run out of tin, not to receive a smaller shipment than expected, not to experience a delay of a season while a new shipment was arranged, to genuinely run out, with no local source to fall back on and no alternative supply route in operation. The workshop would stop. The bronze smiths would have no material to work. The palace administration that tracked their output would have nothing to record. The weapons that wore out would not be replaced. The tools that broke would not be repaired. The whole downstream consequence of a disruption in one input would ripple through every system that depended on that input. This is what scholars of complex systems call fragility. It is the condition of a system that has optimized itself for efficiency at the cost of resilience. A fragile system performs well under normal conditions, better than a less optimized system would, because it has eliminated the redundancy and the slack that a less optimized system carries. But when conditions move outside the normal range, the redundancy and the slack that were eliminated turn out to have been buffers. Without them, a disruption that a more resilient system would have absorbed becomes a disruption that propagates. The late Bronze Age palace economies had spent centuries becoming efficient. They had developed the administrative machinery to track resources with precision. They had built the trade networks to source materials from wherever they were available most reliably. They had specialized their production, concentrating certain kinds of manufacturing in certain places, distributing the different steps of complex production processes across different locations within and between kingdoms. This was, by the standards of the ancient world, an extraordinary achievement. It represented a level of economic organization that would not be matched in the Eastern Mediterranean for several centuries after the collapse. It also meant that each component of the system was dependent on the continued functioning of the components it connected to. The palace workshop needed the tin that came from distant sources through multiple intermediaries. The intermediaries needed stable conditions along the routes they travelled. The stable conditions depended on the political order maintained by the great kingdoms. The great kingdoms depended on the agricultural surplus generated by their subject populations. The agricultural surplus depended on the climate. The climate, as the tree rings and the lake sediments record, was changing. The historian, Eric Klein, in his book published in 2014 under the title 1170, 7 BC, the year civilization collapsed, uses the term perfect storm to describe the confluence of factors that brought the late Bronze Age world down. It is a useful framework, though Klein himself is careful to note its limitations. What the evidence of the Bronze Age collapse suggests is something somewhat more specific than coincidental causes happening to converge. It suggests a system whose interdependencies meant that stresses in one area amplified stresses in other areas, that the failure of one component put pressure on adjacent components, that the network, which had been the source of the system's strength, became, under conditions of stress, the mechanism by which failure propagated. This is the interconnection trap. The same connections that made the system productive in good times made it vulnerable in bad times. The efficiency that had been the system's greatest achievement became, when the conditions that had made efficiency possible began to change, the reason the system could not recover. Consider what recovery would have required. A palace economy that had lost its bronze supply would need to find an alternative. But finding an alternative required the kind of trade connections that the collapse was simultaneously disrupting. A kingdom that had lost population to famine or conflict would need time and stability to rebuild its agricultural base. But time and stability were exactly what the conditions of the collapse were not providing. A diplomatic framework that had managed great power relations for generations would need functioning institutions and functioning communication networks to continue operating. But the institutions and the networks were themselves under stress. Recovery from systemic collapse requires resources. The Bronze Age world, in the decades around 1200 BC, was running out of resources precisely because the system that had generated and distributed those resources was failing. The failure consumed the reserves that might have funded recovery. By the time the stress was acute enough to be undeniable, the capacity to respond to it had already been significantly eroded. There is a word that scholars use for this kind of dynamic: cascade. A cascade failure is what happens when the failure of one component of a system triggers the failure of adjacent components, which triggers further failures, which eventually produces a collapse far larger than any of the individual failures that initiated it. The term comes from the image of water falling over a series of steps, each step receiving the flow from the one above and passing it to the one below, so that what begins as a small stream at the top becomes something much larger by the time it reaches the bottom. The Bronze Age collapse may have been something like that. Not a single catastrophic event, not an invasion from outside or a climate shock of unprecedented severity alone, but a cascade, in which the interdependencies of an exceptionally well connected world became the pathways along which failure travelled. This is why the question of what caused the collapse does not have a simple answer, not because the causes are unknown, though many specific details remain uncertain, but because in a cascade failure, cause and effect are not straightforwardly separable. The drought that reduced agricultural output put pressure on the trade networks that were supposed to compensate for regional shortfalls. The pressure on the trade networks disrupted the supply of materials that the palace economies needed to function. The disruption of the palace economies reduced the political stability that the trade networks depended on to operate safely. The reduced political stability created conditions in which populations moved and conflict spread, and the further disruption of trade routes continued. Each cause was also an effect of something else. Each failure created the conditions for further failure. The scribes at Pylos, who sent men to coastal watch positions in the palace's final administrative period, were responding to a specific threat they could identify: ships on the horizon. They were not responding to the generation of systemic stress that had preceded the moment when those ships appeared. They could not have responded to that, because the shape of that stress was not visible from inside it. The palace administrators who managed the bronze allocations and the grain stores and the textile production were doing their jobs, keeping the system running as long as it could be kept running. They were not managing the collapse of the system. They were managing the system, and the collapse was happening around them and through them in ways that their administrative records were not designed to capture. No one in the late Bronze Age world wrote a document that said the system is failing because it is too interconnected and has no resilience. No one could have written that document, because that kind of analysis requires the outside view, the ability to see the whole system at once, that no one inside the system had. What they wrote instead were letters asking for grain, records of bronze allocations that could not be met because the tin had not arrived, messages about ships on the horizon and cities on fire, the language of people managing specific problems in a world where the specific problems were symptoms of something too large to name. The ship at Uluburun carried the world's connections in its hold, 10 tons of copper, tin from sources whose exact origin is still debated, goods from 7 or more different sources, all loaded into a single vessel because the world was connected enough to make that normal. The ship sank. The connections it represented did not survive much longer, and the world that had made such connections possible, the world of great kings writing to each other in a shared diplomatic language, of palace scribes tracking every fleece of wool and every unit of bronze, of merchants who could assemble a cargo from many different sources and expect to sell it at a profit, That world did not recover. What came after was different, smaller, less connected, less efficient, and, as it turned out, more capable of surviving what came next. Not everything ended. This is worth stating plainly, because the scale of what did end can create the impression of a totality that the evidence does not fully support. The Bronze Age collapse was not the extinction of every civilization in the Eastern Mediterranean. Some things continued, some institutions held, some kingdoms contracted severely and then, over the following centuries, grew back into something recognizable as a state with ambitions and armies and administrative systems. The question of who survived and why is not a simple one, and the evidence does not support a clean answer, but it does point in some directions worth following. Assyria is perhaps the most instructive case, and the most surprising if you approach the collapse expecting only a story of loss. In the period around 1200 BC, the Middle Assyrian Kingdom, centered on the upper Tigris River in what is now northern Iraq, was already a significant power. It had expanded under capable kings in the 13th century BC, pushing its territory westward into Syria and establishing itself as a player in the late Bronze Age international system. It corresponded with Egypt. It participated in the trade networks. It was, in the terminology of the Amarna letters, a brother kingdom among the great powers. The decades around 1200 BC were difficult for Assyria. There is evidence of territorial contraction, of pressure on the kingdom's borders from multiple directions, of reduced administrative activity in some areas. Assyria did not emerge from the collapse period unscathed. It came under serious pressure from groups moving through the region, including peoples the Assyrian texts call the Arameans, who settled extensively in territories that Assyria had previously dominated, and who would remain a persistent feature of the political landscape for centuries. But Assyria did not collapse in the way the Hittite Empire collapsed, or the Mycenaean palace system collapsed. The institutional core of the Assyrian state survived. The kingship continued. The administrative machinery, reduced and strained, kept functioning, and over the following centuries, Assyria rebuilt. By the 9th century BC, the Neo-Assyrian Empire was emerging as the dominant military power in the ancient Near East, eventually controlling territory from the Persian Gulf to the borders of Egypt. The Assyria that built that empire was not identical to the Middle Assyrian kingdom of the Bronze Age. It had changed, as everything changed, in the centuries between, but there was continuity. The institutional thread had not been cut. Something essential had survived the collapse and provided the foundation for what came after. Geography is one factor in this survival. Assyria's core territory in the upper Tigris Valley was somewhat removed from the coastal trade routes that were most severely disrupted during the collapse period. It was also in a region with relatively reliable rainfall agriculture compared to some of the more arid parts of the Near East, which may have provided a degree of insulation from the climatic stresses affecting the region. Less dependence on the disrupted trade networks, more capacity for agricultural self-sufficiency might have offered a buffer that more deeply integrated palace economies did not have. Institutional structure is another factor. The Assyrian state had developed administrative traditions that were somewhat less concentrated in palace centres than the Mycenaean or Hittite model, with commercial networks that had operated with a degree of independence from direct palace control. That flexibility may have given the kingdom more room to adapt when the palace-centred model came under pressure. Now consider a completely different kind of survival story. The cities of the Lebanese coast, Byblos and Sidon and Tyre, did not survive by holding on to what they had been. They survived by becoming something else entirely. These were trading cities, oriented toward the sea, dependent on commerce in ways that made them structurally different from the inland agricultural empires. Their relationship to the palace economy model was always more flexible, more oriented toward merchant enterprise than toward administrative control of production. When the Bronze Age palace network collapsed, these cities lost a trading partner of enormous scale, but they were not the partner. They were the connector and connectors. When one network falls, sometimes find that they are positioned to build another. By the 9th and 8th centuries BC, Phoenician traders were operating across the entire Mediterranean, establishing trading posts and colonies from Cyprus to North Africa to the coast of Spain. They were carrying goods and their writing system to places the Bronze Age world had barely reached. The collapse that had ended the old network had, paradoxically, removed the constraints that the old network had imposed. The Phoenicians were positioned, by geography and by cultural orientation, to take advantage of the resulting openness in ways that the more rigidly palace-centered economies of the Bronze Age had not been. The contrast with Ugarit is worth holding for a moment. Ugarit was also a trading city. Ugarit was also on the Levantine coast. And Ugarit was gone. What made the difference? The Phoenician cities were south of where the worst destructions concentrated. They had slightly different relationships to the palace economy system. They had harbours that continued to offer value even as the larger network contracted. None of these advantages were absolute, and the difference between survival and obliteration in this period sometimes came down to factors that look, from 3,000 years of distance, like the smallest margins imaginable. Egypt's survival has already been touched on in this story, and it is worth returning to briefly with a specific question in mind. Egypt survived not because it was the most powerful state in the system, though it was, and not because it had the best army, though it did. Egypt survived because it had things that retained value even when the network broke. The Nile Valley's agricultural productivity was largely independent of the rainfall variability affecting other parts of the region. The gold of Nubia was inherently portable wealth that did not require a functioning supply chain to be useful, and Egypt had more than 3,000 years of institutional memory, of mechanisms for managing disruption that were embedded deeply enough in its administrative culture to keep functioning even under severe stress. These advantages did not make Egypt immune. The new kingdom contracted. The political coherence of the Egyptian state frayed in the centuries following Ramesses III. Egypt's role as the anchor of the Eastern Mediterranean international system was not recovered. What Egypt survived into was a smaller world. The pattern that emerges from these three cases: Assyria's self-sufficiency, Phoenicia's adaptability, Egypt's depth, has a direction, even if it is not a formula. The entities that survived best were those least dependent on the specific form of interconnection that the late Bronze Age world had developed. Not the most powerful, not the most sophisticated, the most structurally capable of functioning when the network they had been part of stopped working. That is the lesson the evidence offers. Without quite stating it, survival in the Bronze Age collapse was not a reward for virtue or a punishment for weakness. It was, in large part, a function of structure, of how deeply integrated into the collapsing system a given entity was, of what capacity for independent function it retained when the network it had been part of stopped working. The world that came after would be built partly by those survivors, partly from the ruins they built on, and partly from new things that grew in the spaces the collapse had opened. It would take several centuries for that new world to become clearly visible, but it was already beginning. In the reduced and fragmented and struggling communities that persisted through the silence that followed. After the fires, quiet, not the quiet of peace, not the quiet of a world that has settled into a new arrangement and begun the work of rebuilding, a different kind of quiet, the kind that archaeologists encounter when they move up through a destruction layer and find, above it, almost nothing. The technical language for what happened is depopulation, settlement reduction, post, collapse, contraction. These phrases are accurate. They describe something real. They also, in their accuracy, fall somewhat short of what they describe. What they describe is this. In the centuries following the collapse of the late Bronze Age palace systems, the world that had produced the Uluburun cargo and the Amarna letters and the great citadels of Mycenae and the palace archive of Pylos and the trading quarters of Ugarit contracted. It contracted in terms of population. It contracted in terms of the number and size of inhabited settlements. It contracted in terms of the reach of trade networks and the complexity of the goods those networks carried. It contracted in terms of the administrative sophistication of the political entities that replaced the palace kingdoms, and it contracted, most significantly for our ability to understand it. In terms of the written record, Greece went silent first, and most completely. The Linear B script disappeared with the palaces that had used it. It was not a script that had existed outside the palace context. It was not used by merchants in private correspondence or by communities for local administrative purposes. It was palace writing, created to serve palace functions. And when the palaces ended, it ended with them. The Greeks of the following centuries did not write, not because they were incapable of developing a writing system. As the later adoption and adaptation of an alphabetic script would demonstrate, but because the conditions that had created demand for writing in the Mycenaean period, the complex administrative requirements of a palace economy managing thousands of workers and vast quantities of goods, no longer existed. There was nothing that required writing to manage, in the way the palace system had required it, for roughly 3 centuries, from sometime in the 12th century BC to the 9th or perhaps the 8th century BC, the Greek world produced no written record that has survived. This is an enormous span of time, long enough for the specific memories of the Mycenaean world to dissolve into the more general shapes that oral tradition preserves, keeping the emotional structure of what had been while losing almost all the specific administrative detail. What was happening during those centuries is recoverable only partially and imperfectly from the archaeological evidence, from the material remains of settlements and burials and the objects people used and made and left behind. And what that evidence shows, across most of the former Mycenaean world, is a world that had become dramatically simpler. The great citadels were not reoccupied at their former scale. Mycenae had some continued activity, but not the palace complex. Tiryns had some continued activity, but not the palace complex. Pylos had no significant reoccupation. The sites that had been the administrative and economic centres of the Mycenaean world were ruins, inhabited in some cases by much smaller communities that lived among the remains of a world they had no clear memory of and no apparent ability to reconstruct. The pottery of this period is one of the clearest markers of the change. The fine decorated ceramics of the late Bronze Age, the styles that had been traded across the eastern Mediterranean and that reflected the technical achievements of palace workshops, gave way to simpler wares. The transition is visible in the excavated sequence at site after site. Below the destruction layer, the fine pottery. Above it, something coarser, made with less technical sophistication, decorated in simpler patterns or not decorated at all. This is not a judgment about the people who made the simpler pottery. They were people operating in conditions that did not support the specialization and the workshop organization that the finer wares had required. The specialized potters who had worked in palace workshops, trained in particular techniques and supported by palace resources, were gone. What replaced them were potters working in smaller communities without that support, producing what those communities needed with the resources available to them. The same pattern appears in metalwork, in architecture, in the scale of construction, in the evidence of long-distance exchange. Everything that had required the organizational infrastructure of the palace system to sustain it contracted or disappeared when that infrastructure failed. The reach of trade networks in this period collapsed almost as dramatically as the palace systems themselves. The wide distribution of Mycenaean pottery that had characterized the late Bronze Age simply ends. What replaces it, gradually and partially, over the following centuries, is a much more limited pattern of exchange. Local pottery styles distributed across small areas, with occasional longer, distance movement of goods suggesting some connections persisted, but nothing like the integrated network of the Bronze Age. The evidence for iron becoming more common in this period reflects something important about the change in material conditions. Iron ore is far more widely available than the tin that bronze production required. Communities that could no longer access the long, distant supply chains on which bronze depended had local alternatives for iron. The shift toward iron in this period was not primarily about finding a technologically simpler path. The metallurgy of iron is demanding in its own ways. requiring high temperatures and particular knowledge of working and treating the metal. What changed was the logistics of sourcing raw materials. Iron did not require a functioning network of long distance trade to find its starting point. In a world where that network had broken, that difference mattered enormously. In the parts of the former Bronze Age world that had not gone as completely silent as Greece, the picture was somewhat different but pointed in the same direction. Egypt continued to produce written records, and those records document the difficulties of the period without capturing the full scale of the systemic change that had occurred. The Levantine coast had communities that persisted and in some cases grew. Assyria maintained its institutional continuity, though in reduced form. But even in these places, the complexity of the late Bronze Age world, the palace economies and the trade networks and the diplomatic framework of the great kings, was gone. What replaced it was not nothing, but it was less. Centuries of less. Centuries of smaller settlements and simpler pottery and shorter trade routes and no writing in Greece and reduced administrative records elsewhere, and the slow, difficult process of communities finding ways to sustain themselves in a world that had lost most of the organizational infrastructure. It had taken the Bronze Age 1,000 years to build. The farmer working a field near the ruins of Mycenae did not know he was living in a transitional period between two great ages of Mediterranean civilization. He knew that the trade goods that had once arrived from distant places no longer came. He knew that the elaborate world whose remnants surrounded him was beyond the reach of anything he could remember or imagine rebuilding. He did not have a name for what had happened. He only knew the shape of what his life allowed. He was not wrong about any of that. The contraction was real. The difficulty was real. The silence was real. 3 centuries of it, and in that long quiet, slowly and without anyone planning it, the materials for something different were accumulating. Not in the ruins of the palaces, not in the places that had been great, in the smaller, simpler, less visible communities that had persisted through the long contraction, carrying in their spoken traditions and their agricultural knowledge and their remembered gods, the fragments of what the Bronze Age world had been. Without knowing quite what those fragments were or where they had come from, the silence was not the end of the story. It was the space between one story and the next, but it was very long, and the people who lived inside it had no way of knowing that anything else was coming. Let that settle for a moment. 3 centuries, not empty, not peaceful, just smaller and quieter, and more alone than the world had been for a very long time. There is a question that the silence invites. Once you have sat with it long enough, what got through? Not what was preserved in museums or catalogued in archaeological reports, not the tablets baked hard by fire or the copper ingots sitting on the seafloor. Those things survived in the ground, waiting to be found. The question is different. The question is what survived in the living world, what continued to exist, not as buried artifact but as practiced reality. In the communities that persisted through the 3 centuries of contraction that followed the collapse, the answer is less obvious than it might seem, and more interesting. Start with language. Linear B disappeared. The script that the Mycenaean palace administrators had used to track their wool and their bronze and their personnel allocations vanished completely when the palaces that had required it ceased to exist. For 3 centuries, no one in Greece wrote anything. The technology of writing, in the specific form the Mycenaean world had developed it, did not survive the collapse, but the language did. Greek, in forms recognizably ancestral to the Greek of the classical period and to the Greek that scholars study today, continued to be spoken by the communities that persisted through the Dark Ages. The grammar changed. The vocabulary shifted. As vocabularies always shift across centuries of use in changing conditions, but the continuity is real and traceable. The people who emerged from the silence, speaking early forms of what would become classical Greek, were speaking a language that connected them, through an unbroken chain of transmission. To the people who had pressed the Linear B tablets in the Mycenaean palace archives, they did not know this. They had no way to know this, because they could not read the tablets and did not know the tablets existed. The language they spoke was not, for them, a survival from the Bronze Age. It was simply the language they spoke, the language their parents had spoken and their grandparents before them, carried forward through the silence in the most basic and unstoppable way that language travels, from mouth to ear, generation by generation, without requiring any institution to sustain it. Language does not need a palace. It needs people. And people continued. The gods survived too, and their survival is perhaps even more striking than the survival of the language, because it is more specific and more verifiable. The Linear B tablets from Pylos and from other Mycenaean sites include lists of offerings made to specific deities. Among the names on those lists are names that any reader of classical Greek literature would recognize without difficulty. Zeus appears. As the chief deity receiving significant offerings, Hera appears. Poseidon appears. With particular prominence at Pylos, Dionysus appears. In a form that surprised scholars who had assumed from classical sources that his worship was a later introduction to the Greek religious world. These are not obscure or marginal figures. These are the central deities of the classical Greek pantheon, the gods whose stories shaped Greek culture for centuries, and they are present in the Mycenaean religious record. Worshipped at the same palace centres whose administrative and economic functions were about to be destroyed, the palace administration ended. The Linear B records of the offerings ended with it, but the worship continued. The communities that survived the collapse continued to honour these deities, continued to maintain the ritual practices associated with them, continued to tell the stories that gave them their characters and their places in the divine order. By the time the evidence for Greek religious practice becomes abundant again in the early 1st millennium BC, the gods are recognizably connected to the same traditions as the ones whose names appear in the Bronze Age tablets. The gods did not need palaces either. They needed belief, and communities to hold that belief, and the stories that gave the belief its content. All of those things continued through the silence, carried in the same way that language was carried, from one generation to the next, without requiring an institution to sustain them. Agricultural knowledge survived. The cultivation of olives and grapes, two of the most important crops in the Mediterranean agricultural tradition, both requiring years of investment before a planting begins to produce, and both representing the accumulation of considerable knowledge about cultivation, harvesting, pressing, and storage, continued through the collapse period. The disruption of the palace economies removed the administrative systems that had organized and recorded the production of olive oil and wine. But the trees and the vines themselves, and the knowledge of how to tend them, persisted in the communities that remained on the land. This is not a trivial observation. Olive trees take years to mature. The presence of established olive orchards in the post-collapse period implies continuous occupation and continuous cultivation of land that had been farmed in the Bronze Age. The communities that survived did not start from nothing agriculturally. They inherited, even if they did not know it, the work of the Bronze Age farmers who had planted and tended the trees and vines that were still producing when the palaces were ruins. Some maritime knowledge survived. The degree to which seafaring continued through the Dark Ages is debated, and there is clear evidence that the long-distance maritime trade of the Bronze Age contracted severely. But the Aegean is a sea that island and coastal communities cannot simply stop using. The evidence from the post-collapse period includes some continued movement of goods by sea, some continued contact between communities, some persistence of the basic technologies and skills of seafaring. The thread was thin, but it was not entirely cut. Craft skills survived in attenuated form. Pottery making did not disappear. Metalworking did not disappear, though it changed as bronze became less available and iron more common. The basic craft traditions of the ancient Mediterranean, the skills that communities needed to produce tools and containers and structures, persisted through the simplification of the post-collapse world, adapted to reduced conditions and reduced resources, and memory survived, a particular kind of memory, shaped by the conditions of oral transmission, stripped of the administrative detail that writing had preserved, and keeping only what was vivid enough and emotionally resonant enough to survive across generations of retelling. This is the memory that would eventually crystallize into the tradition of poems about heroes who sailed to Troy and fought beneath its walls and struggled to find their way home. The memory of a world that had been powerful and connected and then was not, rendered into the form that memory takes when it has no writing to hold it in place. This oral tradition was not a precise historical record. It could not have been. Across 3 centuries without writing, the specific administrative facts of the Mycenaean world did not survive in oral tradition because they were not the kinds of things that oral tradition preserves. What survived was the emotional architecture of the world that had been lost, the sense of power and scale, the great kings and their rivalries, the ships and the sea, the cities with their massive walls. The oral tradition was wrong about many specific things and right about something more fundamental. It was right that there had been something there. Something larger and more powerful than what the communities of the Dark Ages could produce themselves. It was right that it was gone. It was right that the walls were real, even if the giants who supposedly built them were not. Here is what the surviving things have in common: language, gods, agricultural knowledge, maritime skills, craft traditions, memory. None of them required the palace system to exist. None of them were products of the administrative machinery. The bronze allocations and the wool records and the diplomatic correspondence, they were older than the palaces, or at least independent of them, and so they outlasted them. The palaces had organized and amplified these things. They had put agricultural surplus to use in building monuments and funding specialization and supporting the craftsmen and administrators whose work defined the Bronze Age world at its most sophisticated. But the things themselves, the underlying capacities and practices and beliefs of human communities, had existed before the palaces built their organizational superstructure on top of them, and they continued to exist after that superstructure collapsed. What the collapse destroyed was not civilization in any fundamental sense. It destroyed a particular form of civilization, a particular organization of human capacities and resources that had produced extraordinary achievements and had proven, under the specific conditions of the late 13th and 12th centuries BC, unable to sustain itself. What the collapse did not destroy was the human material from which civilization could be rebuilt. The languages, the beliefs, the agricultural knowledge, the craft skills, the stories, the basic human capacities for organization and cooperation and meaning. Making that had made the Bronze Age world possible in the first place. Those things got through, not intact, not unchanged, not in the form they had taken within the palace system, but present, available, waiting, without knowing they were waiting, for the conditions that would allow them to be organized into something new. The things that survived the Bronze Age collapse did not survive because anyone chose to preserve them. They survived because they did not need the institutions that failed in order to continue. They were carried forward by ordinary people living ordinary lives in reduced and difficult circumstances, speaking their language and honouring their gods and tending their olive trees and telling their stories, doing what people do when the larger structures of their world have failed and life continues anyway. The survivors did not know they were preserving anything. They were just living, but those things they carried forward without knowing they were carrying them became the materials for everything that came after. And what came after was not a restoration. It was something the Bronze Age world had not imagined and could not have planned for. The things that survived did not rebuild the world that had been lost. They became the materials for a world that had never existed before. The world that emerged on the other side of the silence was not a restoration. This matters because there is a natural human tendency to frame recovery from catastrophe as the return of something lost, the rebuilding of what was destroyed. The story of what happened after the Bronze Age collapse does not have that shape. What emerged in the Eastern Mediterranean in the centuries following the silence was structurally different from what had preceded it, organized around different principles, producing different kinds of culture and different kinds of political life. The Bronze Age collapse did not delay the Bronze Age world's further development. It ended the Bronze Age world and made space for something else to begin. That something else took time to become visible. The 9th and 8th centuries BC are when the historical record begins to fill back in meaningfully, when the archaeological evidence starts showing not simply the continuation of post-collapse contraction, but the emergence of something genuinely new. The alphabet is where this new world most clearly announces itself. Writing had not disappeared entirely from the Eastern Mediterranean during the centuries of the Greek Dark Ages. Egypt had continued to use its scripts throughout the period. The cuneiform traditions of Mesopotamia had continued in the surviving states of that region. The Phoenician cities had maintained literacy through the disruptions of the collapse period, using a script that had developed from earlier Canaanite alphabetic traditions that themselves had roots in writing systems that had emerged in the 2nd millennium BC. The Phoenician script was alphabetic in a specific and consequential sense, where the cuneiform systems of Mesopotamia and the hieroglyphic system of Egypt had involved hundreds of signs, and where the Linear B script of the Mycenaean world had involved around 90 signs representing syllables. The Phoenician script used roughly 22 signs, each representing a consonant. The reduction in the number of signs required to achieve basic literacy was dramatic. A script with 22 signs, learnable relatively quickly, was a fundamentally different tool from the complex scripts that had been the exclusive property of specially trained administrators in the Bronze Age palace world. Writing had been, in the Mycenaean world, a palace technology, a tool of administrative control accessible only to those trained within the palace system. After the Phoenicians transmitted and the Greeks adapted their alphabetic script, adding signs for vowels to suit the phonological structure of Greek, writing became available to a much wider range of people than palace writing had ever been. Merchants, craftsmen, communities, individuals with something to record, and the willingness to learn a 22-sign system. The Phoenician merchants who carried this script across the Mediterranean in the 9th and 8th centuries BC were not carrying it as a conscious gift of civilization. They were literate traders who wrote their accounts and their letters in their script, and the people they traded with found it useful and adapted it. The Greeks who adopted and modified the Phoenician alphabet created the direct ancestor of the script these words are written in. This is one of the most consequential acts of cultural transmission in human history. And it happened not through imperial imposition or deliberate cultural policy, but through the practical needs of merchants and the curiosity of the communities they encountered. Take a moment with that. The writing system we use today, the one that carries the words of this story into the air, traces its origins through a chain that runs back through Latin and Greek and Phoenician to the traders of the post-collapse Mediterranean, picking their way through a world the Bronze Age had abandoned, carrying their 22 signs with them because they needed to keep their accounts. The political world that emerged from the silence had a different structure from the one that had preceded it. The great palace kingdoms, with their centralized administrative systems and their control of specialized production and their management of agricultural surplus across large territories, did not return. What emerged instead, at least in the Greek world, was the city-state. The polis was not a diminished version of a Mycenaean palace kingdom. It was a different kind of political unit organized around different principles, oriented toward collective governance rather than palace administration, toward law as a shared framework rather than as an instrument of royal will. The development of the polis was not sudden and was not uniform across the Greek world. Different communities developed different political forms, and the process unfolded across many generations. But the general direction moved away from concentrated palace authority and over time toward the legally regulated and increasingly participatory forms of political life that would produce in Athens in the 5th century BC. One of history's earliest sustained experiments in participatory democratic governance. Democratic governance was not an inheritance from the Bronze Age. The Mycenaean palace kingdoms were not moving toward democracy. The Linear B tablets do not record political assemblies or civic debates. They record palace administration. The political innovation that produced Athenian democracy was something that emerged in the specific conditions of the post-collapse Greek world, where the absence of the palace administrative tradition had left space for different ways of organizing collective life to develop. The same period saw the emergence of written law as a civic institution. The Bronze Age empires had legal traditions, and the Hittite legal codes are among the most sophisticated surviving legal documents from the ancient world. But those traditions were administered by royal authority and recorded in scripts accessible only to trained scribes. The legal traditions that emerged in the Greek city states in the 7th and 6th centuries BC were written in the new alphabetic script, publicly displayed, and understood as applying to the community as a whole, rather than as expressions of royal discretion. All of this took time. The world that produced Athenian democracy in the 5th century BC was not a direct or quick consequence of the Bronze Age collapse. It was the product of many centuries of development in the specific conditions the collapse had created. Conditions that were harsh and difficult for the people living through them, but that also, over time, created space for new ways of organizing human life. The Phoenician cities were developing along different but similarly significant lines. Tyre, in particular, grew in prominence in the period following the collapse, and Phoenician commercial expansion across the Mediterranean represents a fundamentally different model of economic organization from the palace. Centered economies of the Bronze Age. The Phoenicians were not rebuilding the Bronze Age trade network. They were building a different kind of network, organized around merchant enterprise rather than palace administration. Carthage, established according to ancient tradition in the late 9th century BC on the North African coast, would become one of the great commercial powers of the ancient Mediterranean world, demonstrating what a merchant-centered civilization could achieve given time and the right geographic position. In the southern Levant, communities developed in the early Iron Age whose religious traditions would prove to be among the most consequential in human history. Within these communities, religious practices and beliefs developed through complex and contested stages over many generations, gradually moving toward exclusive worship of a single deity and eventually toward the monotheistic traditions that would shape the development of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. This was not a single moment or a single community's invention. It was a long and intricate process, shaped by encounters and conflicts and internal debates across centuries, whose full trajectory extended far beyond the period of the immediate post-collapse world. But its roots were in the communities of the early Iron Age Levant, growing in conditions the Bronze Age collapse had created. None of these developments were inevitable consequences of the collapse. None of them were planned or intended by anyone. They were what happened in the specific conditions the collapse created. In the communities that survived it, and in the centuries that followed the silence, the collapse created conditions. What those conditions produced depended on what the people living in them did, on the specific choices and accidents and innovations of communities living in circumstances they had not chosen. The Bronze Age world built something extraordinary. The world that came after built something else. Both of those things are true. What the preceding chapters have traced is a picture of extraordinary complexity, a world built on connection, stressed by climate, destabilized by cascading failures, partially preserved by those least integrated into what was collapsing, and eventually succeeded by civilizations organized around fundamentally different principles. And yet the central question, the one this story began with, remains open. Why could that world not save itself? Not in the sense of what the contributing factors were. The evidence for drought, for disrupted trade, for population movement, for cascading system failure, has been laid out as clearly as the current scholarship allows. The contributing factors are real. Even if their precise weighting and sequence remain debated, the question is why. This time, those factors produced a collapse the system could not recover from. The Bronze Age world had navigated crises before. It had survived droughts and conflicts and dynastic disruptions over the centuries of its existence. The recovery mechanisms were there. The grain stores, the trade networks, the diplomatic framework of the great kings. Those mechanisms had worked before. This time they did not work. The system contracted and kept contracting. The most careful scholars in the field tend to arrive at a position that holds multiple contributing factors simultaneously. without being able to specify the exact sequence that turned a stressed system into a collapsed one. The systems framework developed by researchers including Eric Klein describes a world whose interdependencies meant that stresses in one area amplified stresses in others, whose efficiency had come at the cost of resilience, whose compensating mechanisms failed because those mechanisms were themselves part of the system that was failing. This framework is compelling. It is the most convincing account currently available, and it still leaves the most specific version of the question unanswered. The debate has not stood still. The science of paleoclimatology continues to refine the picture of what the eastern Mediterranean climate was doing in the late 2nd millennium BC. Ancient DNA analysis is beginning to provide evidence about population movements and demographic changes in ways that the archaeological record alone could not. New excavations at sites across the eastern Mediterranean continue to add material to the picture. The conversation in the field is alive and productive. What the field has not produced, and what may not be producible given the nature of the evidence, is a definitive account that settles the question to everyone's satisfaction. The Bronze Age collapse happened at a distance of more than 3,000 years, in a world that left incomplete records even at its most literate, at a moment when the disruption that ended the palace systems also destroyed much of the evidence that would have been most useful for understanding why they ended. The collapse that we are trying to understand erased much of the evidence we would need to understand it more fully. There is something almost fitting about that, a catastrophe that consumed a significant portion of its own historical record, leaving us to work with fragments, rich and illuminating fragments, but fragments nonetheless. We do not fully know. That is not a failure of scholarship. It is the honest position. It is what the most careful people who have spent their careers on this question have arrived at. And it is what the evidence actually supports. The Bronze Age collapse remains one of the most significant and one of the most incompletely understood events in the history of human civilization. It ended a world that had taken 1,000 years to build, in the space of roughly 50 years, in ways that more than 3,000 years of subsequent inquiry have not fully explained. The question is open. The work continues. That is not nothing. A question that endures for 3,000 years, that still draws careful researchers back to the evidence again and again, is a question worth having. The story does not end with the silence. Stories that end with silence are not quite finished. They have more to say, but they say it slowly, across centuries, in the things that persist after the catastrophe has passed. Consider what the world looked like around 800 BC. Roughly 4 centuries after the collapse had reached its most acute phase, Greece was emerging from its silence. Communities were growing. The archaeological record was filling back in. The alphabet was being adopted and adapted. And writing was returning to the Greek world for the first time since the Linear B scribes had pressed their last tablets. And in communities across the Greek world, a tradition of performance was alive that was already old. A tradition of singing the stories of heroes from a time before memory, of great kings and their rivalries, and the ships that had sailed to a city called Troy, and the years of war beneath its walls and the difficult journeys home. A tradition that had been carrying its material through the silence, generation by generation, in the voices of singers who memorized and performed and gradually shaped what they had received into something that could be transmitted further. By the 8th century BC, this tradition was producing the poems that would eventually be written down and transmitted as the Iliad and the Odyssey, works attributed to a poet or a tradition of poets known as Homer, among the oldest surviving literature in the Western tradition. Those poems are about the Mycenaean world. They are set in the period of the great palace kingdoms, the period of Agamemnon's Mycenae and Priam's Troy. The characters are the kings and heroes of the Bronze Age world, viewed through the transforming lens of 4 centuries of oral transmission without writing. The Iliad and the Odyssey are not historical documents. They are not reliable records of what the Mycenaean world was actually like. The archaeological evidence and the Linear B tablets give us a picture of Mycenaean civilization that differs in many significant ways from the world the poems describe. The palace administrators who tracked wool allocations and bronze distributions do not appear in the Iliad. The complex supply chains that the Uluburun cargo represents find no echo in the heroic tradition. The diplomatic correspondence of the great kings, so carefully preserved in the Amarna archive, becomes in the poems something simpler and more elemental men. Bride, ships, war. What the poems preserved was not the administrative reality of the Mycenaean world. It was the emotional memory of it, the sense of scale and power, the great kings and their rivalries, the walls too massive for later generations to explain without invoking giants, the ships and the sea. 4 centuries of oral transmission did that. 4 centuries of the story being told and retold, each telling, keeping what was memorable and letting the rest go, until what came out the other side was not a record of the Bronze Age, but something that had become, in the deepest sense, a monument to it. We still read those poems. This is worth stopping on. The works attributed to Homer were composed, in the forms we have them, roughly 800 years ago. They describe events set roughly 200 years ago. They are the products of an oral tradition that reaches back further still, into the darkness of the post-collapse centuries, and they are still read, still taught, still translated into new languages and new forms, still producing new responses from new readers across the world. The Hittites also left texts. The archive at Hattusa contained more than 30,000 tablets covering law and history and diplomacy and mythology. Those texts are now read by scholars and translated and studied with considerable care. They have added enormously to our understanding of the Bronze Age world, but they did not enter the living cultural tradition of the subsequent millennia in the way that the poems of the Greek tradition did. They did not travel, through chains of continuous transmission, into the libraries of successive civilizations that each carried them forward. They sat in the ground at Hattusa, unread, for more than 3,000 years, until archaeologists dug them up and specialists learned to decode them. The difference is not a difference in the intrinsic value of what the documents contain. It is a difference in what happened to the chains of transmission that carry knowledge from one era to the next. Some civilizations survive as literature, others survive as archives. That distinction is not a judgment on the civilizations themselves. It is a description of what the Bronze Age collapse did to the chains of memory that carry what a civilization was into the ears of people who were not there. When the chain breaks completely, as it did for the Hittites, the civilization waits in the ground. When the chain holds, however thinly, as it did for the Greek oral tradition through the Dark Ages, the civilization arrives in the future in a form people can still feel and recognize and respond to. The Bronze Age world built something extraordinary. Its collapse was real and enormous, and the losses it produced were real. The people who lived through the famines and the destructions and the 3 centuries of contraction did not benefit from what came after in any way that compensated for what they experienced. But what came after was real too, and we are living in it. The ship at Uluburun carried a world in its hold. 10 tons of copper and the tin to make it into bronze and goods from 7 or more sources loaded into a single vessel, because the world was connected enough to make that normal. That world ended. The copper ingots settled onto the seafloor and did not corrode. The world they were going to be part of did not survive. What came after was different, smaller for a long time, and then larger in new ways, less connected for a long time, and then more connected in different ways, and, in the space left behind by the collapse, across the centuries of the silence and beyond them, the specific forms of human organization and expression and belief that would shape the civilization we live in now were taking their first, uncertain shapes. A tradition of poets, or perhaps many singers across many generations, looked back across the silence at the world that had been and sang of heroes and ships and walls too massive to explain. They did not know the Linear B tablets existed. They did not know the name Mycenaean. They knew only that there had been something there, something that felt like it had mattered, and that it was gone, and that it was worth singing about. We are still singing about it. The tablets are still there. The ash is still in the ground. The copper ingots are still on the seafloor off the cape at Uluburun. not corroded, waiting with the patience of things that have already waited thousands of years. The last messages from Ugarit are still there, baked hard by the fire that ended the city, readable after all this time, sent to a recipient who never arrived. The walls of Mycenae are still there, massive enough that later people looked at them and thought of giants, because no other explanation seemed adequate for something so large and so far beyond what the world they knew could produce. Let the room go quiet around you. Let whatever you are carrying settle into the surface beneath you. The questions that remain open have been open for 3,000 years. They will still be there in the morning. For now, there is only the dark and the distance and the long patience of things that have outlasted the world that made them. Rest